Imagine sitting in a freezing, dimly lit room on a remote Scottish island. Outside, the wind is just howling off the North Sea, rattling the corrugated iron roof of this little readiness hut.
Oh, wow. Yeah, quite the setting.
Right. You are hunched over a chessboard, deeply focused. The room smells of damp wool, stale cigarette smoke, and paraffin. Your opponent, a fellow pilot, reaches out his hand to take your queen. And then the air is just split in half.
The scramble siren.
Exactly. A harsh mechanical scream that instantly shatters the quiet. The chess game ceases to exist. Less than 60 seconds later, you are strapped into a tightly pressurized metal tube, rocketed to 41,000 feet up into the stratosphere.
Incredible.
And you are chasing a mysterious enemy aircraft at 600 miles per hour, pulling so many G-forces that the capillaries in your face literally burst, and you are bleeding onto your white silk flying gloves.
It's an almost incomprehensible image, really. I mean, to go from complete mundane stillness, just moving a wooden piece across a board, to the absolute extreme edges of aerodynamic physics and human physiology in the space of a few minutes.
Yeah, it sounds like sci-fi.
It really does. And the truly staggering thing is that this isn't some scripted sequence in a blockbuster movie. This was a literal Tuesday afternoon for a human being in 1944.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are stripping away the Hollywood glamour, right? We are pushing past the polished retrospective memoirs, the ones written decades later from comfortable armchairs.
Yeah, the sanitized versions.
Exactly. We are ignoring the top-down summaries of World War II aerial combat. We're going straight into the raw, visceral reality of a man who lived it. We are exploring the unedited daily diary of Pierre Clostermann, a book called The Big Show.
Such an important piece of history.
It really is. Our mission today is to plunge you into the intensely physical, mechanically terrifying, and deeply psychological world of the young men who strap themselves to thousands of horsepower, knowing that every time that canopy locks shut, they might just be incinerated in the sky.
The nature of this source material is it's what makes it so incredibly vital. I mean, Pierre Clostermann was a free French fighter pilot flying with the British Royal Air Force. When France fell to Germany, he refused to surrender, eventually making his way to Britain to fly and fight.
Right.
But he didn't write The Big Show with the benefit of hindsight, you know? This was a daily diary kept in a fat, standard-issue Air Ministry notebook. It was stained with spilled tea. It smelled of high-octane aviation fuel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was crumpled by the sheer weight of the parachute he sat on. He carried it with him everywhere. He wrote these entries late at night, hands still shaking from adrenaline, specifically to be sent to his parents in Brazzaville, Africa, in the event he was killed.
Which, statistically speaking, he absolutely should have been. I mean, the life expectancy of a fighter pilot in the thick of the war could sometimes be measured in weeks.
Exactly.
And Clostermann flew an unbelievable 420 operational sorties from 1942 right through the brutal meat grinder of the tactical campaigns, through the Normandy invasion, and all the way into Germany.
To put that into perspective for a second, bomber crews were often rotated out after 25 or 30 missions because the psychological and physical toll was just considered unsurvivable beyond that point.
That's a huge difference.
It really is. To fly 420 combat sorties in single-engine fighter planes where you are the pilot, the navigator, the gunner, and the radio operator all at once, it's a statistical anomaly. It shouldn't happen.
Right. He was a one-man crew doing everything.
Exactly. And because his diary captures this journey day by day, we don't just get a highlight reel. We get a completely unique lens. We see a French pilot wrestling with British engineering, constantly adapting to shifting airframe technologies, brutal weather, and the terrifying industrial scale of the German Luftwaffe.
I want to start by talking about that engineering, because before a pilot could even dream of fighting a German ace in the sky, they had to survive their own airplane. The transition from theoretical training to actually sitting in the cockpit of a frontline fighter sounds like a waking nightmare. Let's put you right there for Clostermann's very first encounter with a Supermarine Spitfire. This is at an operational training unit in Wales.
Right. He's basically fresh out of the classroom.
Yeah, he spent weeks looking at diagrams, reading manuals, but now a mechanic points to a real live machine, and he is given exactly 60 minutes to prove he can fly it without killing himself.
We have to forget the modern conception of airplanes here. There are no fly-by-wire computers. There are no automated safeguards. A Spitfire Mark 1 or 2 is essentially a massive 1,030 horsepower, 12-cylinder Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with a remarkably fragile, lightweight aluminum airframe bolted to the back of it.
Just a giant engine with wings.
Pretty much. It was a machine built for one single purpose: extreme violence in the air. Comfort and ease of use were definitely not on the blueprint.
He describes the sensory overload of just getting into the seat as overwhelming. He climbs in, and he is suddenly surrounded by this maze of dials, levers, and toggles, and he has to recite this vital life-or-death cockpit drill just to turn the engine on.
The BTFC PPUR drill.
Yes, exactly. Brakes, trim, flaps, contacts, pressure, petrol, undercarriage, radiator. Every single one of those required a physical, manual action. I'm trying to picture the stress of this. The mechanic slams the little side door shut, and Clostermann is imprisoned in this cramped metal box, trembling. He hits the starter button. And the plane doesn't just quietly hum to life, right? It violently erupts.
Oh, yeah. The startup sequence of a Merlin engine is a violent mechanical explosion. Clostermann writes about the massive exhaust stubs right in front of his face, vomiting blue flames and thick black smoke.
That sounds terrifying.
It is. The entire airframe begins to shudder violently, shaking like a high-pressure steam boiler about to burst. And remember, he hasn't even moved an inch yet. He's just trying to process the sheer noise and vibration.
Let's break down some of that BTFC PPUR drill, because he specifically talks about how complex it was. Brakes, for instance. These aren't like car brakes, are they?
Far from it. The Spitfire used a pneumatic braking system powered by compressed air. You had a lever on the control column, the main stick you used to fly. But to steer the plane on the ground, you squeezed that brake lever while simultaneously pushing the rudder pedals left or right with your feet.
That sounds like rubbing your belly and patting your head while driving a race car.
It required immense coordination. Squeeze too hard while taxiing, and the massive weight of the engine up front would cause the plane to flip right over onto its nose, burying the propeller in the dirt.
Wow. And there's T for trim. I know we'll talk about trim tabs later when things get really extreme, but even on the ground, setting the trim was vital, right?
Absolutely. A trim tab is a small, adjustable flap on the trailing edge of the main control surfaces, like the elevators on the tail or the rudder. Because an airplane's center of gravity and aerodynamic pressures change depending on fuel weight and speed, the pilot has to constantly wind these little mechanical wheels in the cockpit to adjust the trim tabs.
So you're constantly rebalancing the plane.
Right. It relieves the physical pressure on the control stick. If you take off with your elevator trim set incorrectly, the second your wheels leave the ground, the plane might violently pitch straight up into a stall or nosedive straight into the runway.
So he gets through this labyrinth of a checklist, he pushes the throttle forward, and he notes how incredibly terrifyingly sensitive the controls are. It is not like turning the steering wheel of a truck. He says the absolute slightest pressure from a finger or a toe, and the machine literally leaps into the sky.
The Spitfire was an aerodynamic marvel precisely because of that sensitivity. The engineers designed it to be an extension of the pilot's central nervous system. The famous elliptical wings weren't just for show. They provided incredible lift and a remarkably tight turning radius.
But I'm guessing that responsiveness was a double-edged sword for a rookie.
Oh, 100%. That extreme responsiveness meant that if you panicked, if your hand jerked on the stick out of fear, the plane would react instantly and violently. Operating it required reflexes trained to the absolute point of subconscious automation. I mean, the human brain simply isn't naturally evolved to process spatial orientation in 3 dimensions while traveling at 350 miles per hour.
It sounds like trying to perform intricate neurosurgery while riding a bucking bronco. You push the stick forward to dive, the ground hurtles up at your windshield, you pull back, and suddenly this invisible leaden weight physically crushes your spine down into the C-band, driving your head down into your shoulders. The plane bounces on the thermals like a steel ball bearing hitting a marble block. It is a physical beating.
It is a profound physical assault. And then comes the most terrifying part of that first hour, which is trying to land. Because here, Clostermann confronts a massive design quirk of the Spitfire. It was a tail-dragger aircraft.
The tail dragger.
Ah, yeah, so the 2 main landing wheels are up near the front, and there's a tiny wheel all the way at the back of the tail. When the plane is on the ground or coming in for a low-speed landing, the nose points sharply up into the air.
Which means that massive 1,000 horsepower Merlin engine is sticking right up in front of your face.
Precisely. From the pilot's seat, your forward visibility during a landing approach is exactly 0. You are completely blind to what is directly in front of you.
Wait, really? Completely blind.
Completely. You have to fly the plane down by looking out the side windows, using peripheral vision to judge your distance to the grass, while locked in a tiny box, deafened by the engine, trying to balance this heavy, volatile machine right on the edge of its stalling speed. It was a baptism of pure, unadulterated terror before he ever even saw a swastika painted on a wing.
And that terror of the environment and the machine was completely justified. We think of casualties in war coming from bullets and bombs, but death was a constant lingering presence just from the act of flying. There is a moment early in the diary, still during this winter training in Wales, that just stops you cold. One of Clostermann's French comrades, a young pilot named Pierre de Gale, goes missing. He flies into a dense layer of mist and just disappears.
The weather over the British Isles was notoriously unpredictable and lethal, especially in the mountainous regions of Wales and Scotland. Clouds could form out of nowhere, completely robbing a pilot of all visual reference.
And they didn't have modern instruments.
Right. Without modern GPS or advanced instrument flying techniques, a pilot caught in dense fog easily suffered from spatial disorientation. Your inner ear literally lies to you. You think you are flying straight and level, but you are actually in a banking dive.
It takes the search parties 2 full days to find Pierrot's wreckage. He had crashed into an ice-covered hilltop. But the tragic detail here, the thing that really underscores the absolute brutality of their reality, is how they found him. They found his body outside the plane, kneeling in the snow.
Yeah, that part is so tough to read.
He had his head resting in his arms, looking almost like a sleeping child, right beside the shattered fuselage of a Spitfire. Both of his legs had been broken in the crash impact. He couldn't walk. He hadn't died from the trauma of the crash. He had slowly frozen to death overnight on that freezing Welsh hill, completely alone.
It establishes the baseline stakes for the men. Before you even factor in a human enemy actively trying to kill you, the basic environment, the freezing temperatures, the blinding clouds, the unforgiving physics of the airframe was actively lethal. The margin for error was literally zero.
Clostermann describes carrying Pierrot's coffin under the freezing rain, listening to the wet British soil hit the wood. And the psychological burden of that is immense. You carry your friend to his grave, and then you have to go right back to the airfield, caught into the exact same type of machine that just killed him, and try to learn how to fight in it.
Which is a psychological shock that no amount of classroom training can mitigate. Once he survives learning the aircraft, the narrative shifts drastically. Clostermann is deemed ready for the front line. He is posted to the 341 Alsace Squadron. This was a unique unit composed entirely of free French pilots who had escaped the occupation of their homeland. And they were commanded by a man who sounds almost mythical, Commandant René Michaud.
Michaud steps onto the pages of this diary like a titan. Clostermann describes him as a tall, dark, commanding presence, with this snapping, authoritative voice that admitted absolutely no argument. But that strict discipline was followed by a genuinely warm, friendly smile. He was the archetype of the veteran leader, someone who had seen it all, survived it all, and projected this aura of total invincibility. You get the sense these young pilots would have gladly followed him straight into the gates of hell.
Michaud was vital to their morale, and the setting of their assignment further amplified this sense of elite status. The Alsace Squadron was stationed at RAF Biggin Hill. For anyone familiar with the Battle of Britain, Biggin Hill is hallowed ground. It was the premier fighter base of the Royal Air Force, holding the highest number of aerial victories. It was the tip of the spear.
I can imagine the atmosphere there was incredibly intimidating for a new pilot.
Oh, it was a fascinating blend of extreme danger and strange aristocratic glamour. They were given the absolute latest state-of-the-art aircraft, the Spitfire Mark IX. The officers' mess was comfortable, there were orderlies, clean sheets, polished silver. You could fly a life-or-death combat mission over France in the morning, and theoretically take a train into London for dinner at the Savoy Hotel that evening.
But that pristine, almost gentlemanly bubble of the airbase is completely shattered the second they cross the English Channel. Clostermann's first big show, his first major operational combat sweep, is an escort mission for American B-17 Flying Fortresses over Amiens, France. I found his internal monologue leading up to this mission absolutely fascinating. He is sitting in the briefing room, looking at the massive map, listening to the intelligence officers detail the impossible logistics of coordinating hundreds of planes at different altitudes.
The scale is just massive.
Right. And he admits to this deep, almost morbid curiosity about what he calls real fear. He's watching these hardened veterans casually eat mashed potatoes and smoke cigarettes, and he's intensely analyzing his own body, wondering how his nervous system is going to react when the bullets start flying.
He provides a brilliant psychological insight here. He isn't primarily afraid of dying. He is afraid of his own biology.
Exactly. I love the analogy he uses. He goes back to his childhood, remembering playing goalie in a school soccer match. He describes a moment where a massive, aggressive opposing player was charging the net with the ball. Clostermann knew exactly what he had to do. He had to dive headfirst to the player's boots to smother the ball and save the goal. But at the very last microsecond, his body betrayed his brain. He involuntarily flinched.
Just natural self-preservation.
Yeah, he twisted his body away to avoid the sharp cleats, and the striker scored. Sitting in that briefing room at Biggin Hill, his ultimate terror was that his physical body would involuntarily flinch in combat, that he would panic, jerk the stick, abandon his formation, and betray his mind's determination to be brave.
It perfectly captures the internal war that precedes the external one. And when they finally scramble, get into the air, and cross the French coast, all of the clean, geometric tactics they discussed on the chalkboard instantly disintegrate. Cinematic representations of aerial combat often depict dogfights as these graceful, flowing, almost choreographed duels between two knights of the sky. Clostermann's ground-level, or rather cockpit-level account reveals it as an absolute, unmitigated nightmare of chaos and centrifugal force.
It is total sensory overload. They're flying at 27,000 feet, the temperature is freezing, the controller's voice is crackling over the static of the radio, calling out compass bearings. Suddenly, Clostermann sees these tiny white condensation trails miles away. It is the German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters converging on the bomber formation.
Here they come.
As the reality of the intercept sets in, he describes his throat physically contracting until he can barely swallow. His toes are involuntarily curling inside his heavy fleece-lined boots. He feels like he is suffocating, stifled in a straitjacket of canvas belts, parachute harnesses, and oxygen tubes.
I want to focus on the Focke-Wulf 190 for a moment, because understanding the enemy machine explains why the combat was so chaotic. Up until 1941, the Spitfire had largely dominated the German Messerschmitt 109s. But when the FW-190 appeared, it was a profound shock to the RAF. It used a massive air-cooled BMW radial engine, a big blunt nose compared to the Spitfire's sleek, pointed snout.
How did that change the dynamics of a dogfight? I mean, if the Spitfire was so agile, why were they so terrified of this blunt-nosed Focke-Wulf?
It came down to speed and roll rate. The FW-190 was heavier, but it was incredibly fast, especially in a dive. More importantly, its wings were incredibly stiff, and its aileron controls were beautifully designed, meaning the Focke-Wulf could snap into a roll faster than almost any other plane in the world.
So they couldn't turn inside a Spitfire, but they could outroll it.
Exactly. In a dogfight, if a Spitfire got behind a Focke-Wulf, the German pilot wouldn't try to outturn the Spitfire, which would be fatal. Instead, the German would simply throw his stick to the side, roll the plane upside down in a fraction of a second, and pull back into a screaming vertical dive. The Spitfire simply couldn't roll fast enough to follow them. It forced the British pilots into entirely new, highly reactive modes of fighting.
And Clostermann experiences this sheer speed and violence instantly. The formation of Spitfires is flying straight, and then suddenly the radio erupts with someone screaming, "Brake! Brake!" At 400 miles per hour, the sky, which was completely filled with the reassuring shapes of friendly Spitfires a second ago, is suddenly completely empty.
The visual of that is crazy.
Everyone violently yanks their control sticks to evade the invisible German planes diving on them. Clostermann is thrown into a vortex of centrifugal force. His flight leader, the man he is supposed to follow like a shadow, simply disappears.
He is suddenly alone in a three-dimensional arena where threats can come from above, below, behind, or out of the blinding glare of the sun. The G-forces hit him like a physical blow.
He notes that he was squeezed down into his seat so hard by the positive G-forces that his gorge was rising, his stomach pushing up into his chest. Just the physical exertion of moving the control column at 400 miles per hour requires massive, exhausting strength. The air rushing over the control surfaces at those speeds makes the ailerons feel like they're set in wet concrete. He is completely disoriented, drenched in sweat, firing his 20-millimeter cannons wildly into empty space just out of pure adrenaline.
But he survives. His body doesn't betray him. He doesn't flinch away from the fight. In fact, just a few short missions later, this sheer terror transitions into a profound and disturbing euphoria. He achieves his first major aerial victories, shooting down 2 Focke-Wulf 190s in a single mission.
Reading his account of these kills is deeply unsettling because of how raw it is. This wasn't a modern war where a pilot presses a button and watches a digital blip disappear on a radar screen from 40 miles away. He had to fly close. incredibly intimately close.
The convergence range for the Spitfire's guns was usually set between 200 and 250 yards. At those speeds, that is essentially knife fighting distance. You are close enough to see the rivets on the enemy's wings, the exhaust stains on their fuselage, and the human being sitting in the cockpit.
Clostermann describes diving vertically onto one of the German planes. As he pulls his Spitfire up, hauling back on the stick to bring his gun sight through the target, he actually sees the white smudge of the German pilot's face turned up, looking at him through the glass canopy.
Eye contact at 400 miles an hour.
Right. They make eye contact right as Clostermann squeezes the firing button. He feels his whole plane shudder as the cannons fire. He watches his explosive shells chew up the Focke-Wulf's fuselage, ripping panels of metal away. The enemy cockpit shatters. The plane catches fire, a dark shape. The pilot tumbles out of the inferno and a parachute snaps open like a puff of white smoke against the blue sky.
And his reaction to this intimate act of destruction is what makes the diary so authentic. He doesn't write a solemn, regretful passage about the tragic loss of human life.
No. He brags about it over the open radio frequency like a kid who just scored the winning touchdown. He is screaming into his oxygen mask, "I got one. Jesus, I got one." When he lands back at Biggin Hill, he writes about feeling incredibly lighthearted. He has a huge appetite in the mess hall. He feels an intoxicating high.
But we have to analyze this euphoria. It is a vital but incredibly fragile coping mechanism. These men were in their early 20s. To maintain their sanity, they had to gamify the slaughter. They treated it like an extreme sport complete with scoreboards, painted kill tallies on the sides of their planes, and competitive banter.
So it's basically a psychological defense.
Exactly. Because if they sat alone in their rooms and truly processed the reality that they were actively incinerating other young men and that they themselves were mathematically guaranteed to die if they kept flying, their minds would snap. The bravado, the bragging, the lightheartedness, it's all a psychological shield.
That makes total sense. But a shield that brittle can't withstand the reality of a long war. And on August 27th, 1943, that shield is completely shattered. This entry in the diary is just devastating to read. The Alsace Squadron is up on another escort mission, but the intelligence was wrong, or the Germans had laid a massive trap. They are hopelessly, overwhelmingly outnumbered.
It was an ambush. A massive concentration of German fighter wings had been vectored directly into their flight path.
Clostermann describes looking around and realizing their 24 Spitfires are flying into a swarm of what looks like over 200 Focke-Wulfs. The sky instantly turns into a slaughterhouse. Parachutes are popping open everywhere. Planes are tumbling down in balls of fire. The radio chatter is a cacophony of desperate screams, warnings, and static.
It's just complete chaos.
And then cutting through the chaos comes the voice of Commandant Mouchot, the invincible leader, the idol of the squadron. He transmits just 3 agonizing words: "I am alone."
And then absolute silence. He was never heard from again. His body washed up on the coast of Belgium weeks later. The veteran, the titan, the man they all believed was untouchable, was simply erased from the sky in a fraction of a second.
I want to pause here and really think about the psychology of the surviving pilots. Clostermann lands, and the realization hits the squadron. How do you reconcile this? You have spent the last month treating horrific face-to-face violence as a thrilling game of skill. But when your invincible mentor just vanishes into thin air, it proves that skill doesn't matter. The game is rigged. How do you climb back into the cockpit the next morning, knowing that if Mouchot couldn't survive, you have absolutely zero chance?
You don't reconcile it. You bury it. The diary entries following Mouchot's death reflect a profound loss of innocence. The concept of the noble duel evaporates. It becomes a fatalistic industrial grind. You see a shift in the pilots. They stop believing they will survive the war. They accept that they are dead men walking, and their only remaining objective is to take as many of the enemy with them as possible before their number is called.
And the physical environment of Clostermann's war changes right along with this psychological crash. The pristine, elite bubble of Biggin Hill bursts. Clostermann is transferred. He is sent to the RAF 602 Squadron, the City of Glasgow Squadron. Thematically and literally, it feels like he is dragged out of the glamorous heavens and thrown face first into the freezing mud.
The contrast is incredibly jarring. He is moving from air defense of Great Britain into the 2nd Tactical Air Force. The strategic mission has changed. They are no longer defending London from high-altitude bombers. They are preparing to support a ground invasion of Europe. This requires them to operate from advanced temporary airfields. Clostermann arrives at Airfield 125 at Dungeness, right on the marshy coast of the English Channel.
He calls the living situation commando conditions. The comfortable officer messes are gone. The orderlies are gone. They are sleeping on canvas cots in uninsulated tents, pitched in a muddy orchard. The winter wind off the channel cuts right through the canvas. They're desperately stealing coal from a nearby railway line just to keep a small stove burning so they don't freeze to death in their sleep.
A far cry from dinner at the Savoy Hotel.
Oh, totally. There are issued these terrible, faulty paraffin storm lanterns that constantly explode, setting their tents on fire in the middle of the night. They wake up at dawn shivering violently and have to trudge through the mud to wash their faces in a freezing, icy river. The glamour of the fighter pilot is completely dead.
But out of that mud and misery, a completely different type of camaraderie emerges. The 602 Squadron was an incredibly wild, eclectic mix of men. You had rough-hewn Scotsmen, brash Australians, cynical Canadians, and isolated Frenchmen. They were essentially pirates of the air because they were living in squalor and flying incredibly dangerous, low-level missions. They developed a culture of intense, fatalistic hedonism. They drank hard, they fought, and they lived minute to minute.
Clostermann writes about an incident when they are given a short 48-hour leave in London. It perfectly captures this fatalistic madness. They get entirely blindly drunk. They are marching through a London train station, singing incredibly lurid, profane songs at the top of their lungs. They essentially commandeer an entire train carriage, get into a physical brawl with the military police who try to stop them, and one of the pilots actually steals a station master's gold-braided cap to keep as a trophy. It is reckless, destructive, borderline sociopathic behavior.
It is the behavior of men who have completely detached from civilian morality, because civilian morality doesn't apply when your day job involves flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire. They are exercising the sheer terror of their daily existence. And that terror was inextricably linked to the new machines they were forced to fly. When Clostermann arrives at 602 Squadron, he is horrified to discover what he has to take into combat. They aren't flying the beautiful high-altitude Spitfire Mark 9s anymore. They are issued the Spitfire Mark VD.
The pilots had a dark nickname for this specific variant. They called it clipped, cropped, and clapped. I really need you to break down what that actually means mechanically, because the way Clostermann describes flying, it sounds like an absolute death trap. Why were these planes so terrible? Let's start with clipped.
To understand the Spitfire VD, you have to understand that it was a desperate, highly specialized modification forced by changing German tactics. The Luftwaffe began using Focke-Wulf 190s to launch lightning-fast, extremely low-altitude hit-and-run bombing raids on coastal towns in England. They would fly just feet above the ocean to avoid British radar, drop their bombs, and speed away. A standard Spitfire couldn't catch them or maneuver well enough at sea level. So Vickers engineers took the standard Spitfire wings and literally sawed off the beautiful elliptical wingtips. They squared them off, reducing the wingspan by roughly 4 feet.
I keep thinking about the physics of that. I mean, if the elliptical wing is what gave the Spitfire its legendary turning ability, isn't chopping off the ends like cutting the fins off a shark, why would you deliberately ruin the plane's greatest advantage?
It comes down to a trade-off between turning radius and roll rate. By cutting off the wingtips, you significantly reduce the physical surface area, which decreases lift and ruins the turning radius. But more importantly, you eliminate the rotational mass at the extreme edges of the wings. Imagine holding a heavy dumbbell in each hand with your arms spread wide and trying to spin your body in a circle. It's difficult. Now pull those dumbbells close to your chest and spin. You spin much faster. By shortening the wings, the clipped Spitfire could roll on its central axis, incredibly fast matching the Focke-Wulf's evasive maneuvers at low altitude.
Okay, that explains the clipped wings. What about cropped? Clostermann talks about the supercharger being altered.
An aircraft engine needs oxygen to burn fuel. At higher altitudes, the air is thin, so engines use superchargers, essentially massive air compressors driven by the engine itself, to force feed dense air into the cylinders. The Spitfire VD featured a cropped supercharger impeller. The engineers shaved down the compressor blades so the engine was optimized purely for the thick, dense air right at sea level. This modification gave the Merlin engine a massive, violent boost of power at 0 altitude, pushing it to almost 1,600 horsepower. It made the plane blindingly fast right off the deck.
But there's a fatal catch, right?
A massive catch. Because the supercharger was castrated for sea-level performance, the moment the pilot climbed above 8,000 feet, the engine simply couldn't breathe. The air got too thin, the cropped supercharger couldn't compress enough oxygen, and the engine power dropped off a cliff.
To put this in perspective, it is like taking an Olympic marathon runner, a guy built for long distances at high altitudes, and throwing him into waist-deep water. For the first 10 feet, he might muscle through it, but very quickly, he's going to suffocate and collapse. If one of these Spitfires was caught by a German fighter at 15,000 feet, the Spitfire was essentially a sitting duck. It became a sluggish lump of lead.
Exactly, and the final nail in the coffin was the word clapped. It was RAF slang for worn out. The airframes they were given weren't new. They had hundreds of combat hours on them. The aluminum was fatigued. The engines had been pushed past their thermal limits countless times. The joints rattled. They were flying exhausted, heavily modified Frankenstein machines.
And the mission's high command ordered them to fly in these clapped-out machines were borderline suicidal. There's an Operation Clostermann details called the Munsterland business that is just horrifying. The Munsterland was a massive, heavily armed German blockade runner ship. It managed to slip past the Royal Navy and take refuge in the heavily fortified French harbor of Cherbourg. The British desperately needed to sink it before its cargo could be unloaded.
The tactical problem was the weather. It was atrocious. Thick, impenetrable cloud cover, fog, and driving rain down to the surface. High-altitude, level bombing was completely impossible. The bombardiers wouldn't be able to see the ship until they'd already flown past it.
So Command comes up with a plan that sounds completely unhinged. They decide to send in Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers, each carrying massive 1,000-pound bombs, to attack the ship at sea level. But to give the Typhoons a chance to survive the German anti-aircraft fire, they order Clostermann and the 602 Squadron to fly their clipped-wing Spitfires in ahead of the bombers. Their sole objective is to fly directly into the harbor, shoot at the flagships with their 20mm cannons, and physically draw the anti-aircraft fire onto themselves so the Typhoons can drop their bombs. They are literal bait.
It requires flying into what is essentially a fortified canyon of artillery.
Clostermann's description of the approach is terrifying. I want to convey the claustrophobia of this. They take off from England, drop down to the English Channel, and they are flying at 0 feet. Literally 10 to 15 feet above the gray, choppy, freezing waves of the ocean. They are flying in dense fog, doing 300 miles an hour. It requires absolute, singular target fixation just to stay alive. If a pilot's attention drifts for a microsecond, if he pushes the stick forward a millimeter too far, or if his clapped-out engine splutters, his propeller hits the water and the plane disintegrates instantly.
It is the ultimate test of nerve. Ground effect physics come into play here. The air compressed between the wing and the ocean surface creates a cushion, but it makes the plane bounce unpredictably.
And then suddenly the fog breaks. They cross the breakwater, and they are inside the Cherbourg roadstead. Clostermann is flying into an inferno. The entire harbor erupts. The Germans have flagships arrayed all around the Munsterland. These aren't guys shooting rifles. These are quad-barreled 37mm automatic cannons pumping out high-explosive shells at hundreds of rounds a minute.
The sky is instantly crisscrossed with thick ropes of green, red, and yellow tracer fire. The sheer volume of lead in the air makes it mathematically improbable to survive. Clostermann sees his assigned target, a German flagship, looming right in front of his windshield. He doesn't pull up, he dives even lower. He physically nestles his head down behind the small square of bulletproof glass in his canopy and hunches behind his armored seatplate. He is flying so low that his propeller is kicking up a wake in the water. Wow. He flies directly into the geysers of water being thrown up by the German shells exploding in the harbor. He gets so close to the ship that as he opens fire with his cannons, he can clearly see the German sailors on the deck dropping their ammunition and diving flat on their faces in terror. He hauls back on the stick at the absolute last second, pulling his Spitfire violently up over the ship. He passes so close that his left wingtip literally violently scrapes against the steel radio mast of the ship, tearing aluminum away. The visual of that is staggering. A plane doing over 300 miles an hour, skimming a steel mast by inches. And amidst this total chaos where the harbor is seething with exploding bombs, sinking ships, and typhoons vanishing in giant fireballs, another threat appears.
Yeah, German fog wolves drop out of the low clouds right on top of them. Clostermann pulls out of his attack run and suddenly finds himself head-on with a German fighter at an altitude of maybe 100 feet. They're closing on each other at a combined speed of 600 miles an hour. Less than 100 yards apart, the German fires. A 20mm high-explosive shell strikes the armor glass of Clostermann's windshield. It doesn't penetrate, but the shockwave deafens him. As the Focke-Wulf flashes right over his canopy, so close he feels the wake turbulence physically slam his plane down toward the water. Clostermann realizes his plane is covered in thick, black fluid. The German plane was damaged, and a massive stream of pressurized engine oil from the Focke-Wulf has sprayed directly across Clostermann's windshield.
He is suddenly flying completely blind. inside the most heavily defended airspace in France, inches above the water, in a battered airplane, with his forward visibility totally obscured by thick oil.
He has to fly back across the English Channel, navigating purely by his instruments, wiping the side blisters of his canopy with his glove just to catch a glimpse of the horizon. When he finally lands back at base, his mechanic points out that a German shell had severed his pneumatic brake lines. The fact that he survived the Münsterland business is miraculous. But what it really highlights is how high command strategic failures forced these specialized tactical pilots into scenarios that push the absolute boundaries of human and mechanical endurance.
Because command realized they were failing to gain total air superiority at these lower altitudes, and because the tactical bombing of things like ships and train yards wasn't stopping the German war machine, the Allied strategy shifted. They decided they had to destroy the German industrial capacity at its source. This meant deep penetration, high-altitude strategic daylight bombing over Germany itself. But sending unescorted bombers into the heart of the Reich was proving to be a slaughter.
The American 8th Air Force was taking catastrophic losses.
Yeah.
The D-17 Flying Fortresses had heavily armed gunners, but without fighter escorts to protect them, the German interceptors were tearing them to pieces. So the RAF fighters were ordered to help escort the American bombers as far as they could. But here is the fundamental problem. A Spitfire is a defensive interceptor. It was designed to climb quickly, fight over England, and land. It did not have the fuel capacity to fly deep into Germany and back.
To solve this massive logistical hurdle, the engineers hastily devised a terrifying solution. They built massive teardrop-shaped external fuel tanks that held 90 gallons of highly volatile aviation fuel. They physically bolted these massive tanks to the underbellies of the Spitfires,
which completely ruined the aerodynamics of the plane. Clostermann writes that taking off with this massive, sloshing bomb of liquid strapped to the belly shifted the center of gravity so violently that taking off felt like landing on eggs. The planes were desperately heavy, sluggish, and incredibly vulnerable to attack until they could burn off that external fuel and drop the tanks.
This sets the stage for one of the most horrific aerial battles of the war, the Schweinfurt Raid on October 14, 1943. The Americans launched hundreds of bombers to destroy the vital ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep in Germany. Clostermann's squadron was tasked with flying escort for part of the route.
When they fly out over the continent and finally rendezvous with the bomber stream, Clostermann isn't greeted by the neat, orderly parade ground formations of planes you see in newsreels. He arrives at the scene of an apocalypse. He calls it a witch's Sabbath. The massive defensive combat boxes of the B-17s have already been shattered.
The Luftwaffe employed terrifying new tactics against the bombers. Heavily armored twin-engine fighters were sitting out of range of the bombers' defensive guns, firing massive air-to-air rockets into the formations to break them apart. Once a bomber was crippled and fell out of the protective formation, the single-engine Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts would swarm it like sharks sensing blood. They realized the B-17 lacked heavy forward-facing armament, so the German fighters would attack from the front, flying head-on into the bombers at a combined closing speed of nearly 600 miles an hour, raking the cockpits with cannon fire.
Clostermann describes a sky filled with burning aluminum. The air is so thick with the black, greasy smoke of dying engines that it obscures the sun. He watches helplessly as massive four-engine B-17s suddenly violently explode, blossoming into giant dark mushrooms of fire and debris, and the human toll is ever present. He sees parachutes popping open everywhere amidst the wreckage. He uses this hauntingly poetic image, he says. The white canopies of the parachutes drifting down through the smoke look like shining new nails on a wall.
It forces the fighter pilots into a desperate reactionary battle. They are heavily outnumbered, flying sluggish planes burdened by drop tanks, trying to plug the holes in a crumbling dam.
Clostermann and his wingman spot a crippled American B-24 Liberator bomber. One of its engines is engulfed in flames, trailing a massive plume of white smoke, and it is lagging behind the main formation. A swarm of Focke-Wulfs is circling it, preparing to move into the kill. Clostermann physically wrestles with the mechanical release lever, drops his massive fuel tank, and he and his wingman dive straight into the swarm to try and save the bomber.
This is the ultimate tragedy and the immense psychological burden of the escort fighter pilot. You are no longer just a solitary knight fighting for your own survival. You are agonizingly responsible for the 10 young men trapped inside that burning, helpless bomber. Clostermann throws his plane into incredibly violent maneuvers, pulling extreme Gs, firing short bursts just to force the German fighters to break off their attack runs. He is desperately weaving back and forth over the crippled Liberator, acting as a human shield.
And despite risking his own life, despite burning up his ammunition and his critical fuel supply, sometimes it just isn't enough. The sheer mathematics of the battle overcome them. He has to watch in horror as a German fighter finally slips through his defense, rakes the Liberator with cannon fire, and the massive bomber is literally cut in half midair, spinning violently down into the sea. Clostermann is left flying circles in an empty sky, helpless, watching the wreckage sink. The crushing weight of that helplessness is unimaginable.
It is a profound emotional trauma, but the war offered absolutely no time to process it. Because as terrible as the high-altitude escort missions were, an entirely new, deeply psychological weapon was being unleashed back at low altitude. In late 1943 and early 1944, the RAF became aware of the German V weapon program, specifically the V-1 flying bombs.
The no-balls, as the Allied pilots nicknamed the launch sites. The V-1 was essentially an early cruise missile. The Germans were rapidly building these massive, heavily camouflaged concrete ski ramps hidden in the dense forests along the French coast, pointed directly at London. It was an automated terror weapon designed to indiscriminately slaughter civilians. High command panicked, rightfully so, and ordered the immediate destruction of these sites. But the strategy they employed was, again, staggeringly costly to the pilots.
The V-1 sites were incredibly difficult to destroy from high altitude. The concrete ramps were narrow, buried in the trees, and hard to spot. Heavy bombers were inaccurate, so command ordered low-level, precision tactical strikes. But because the Spitfire carried a very light payload, they utilized older Hawker Hurricane fighters, retrofitted to carry heavy, unguided air-to-ground rockets. The strategy was to send these slow, heavy, obsolete Hurricanes in at literal treetop height to fire their rockets directly into the concrete bunkers.
And to understand why this was a suicide mission, we have to talk about the defenses. The Germans knew these sites were vital, so they surrounded them with the most terrifying anti-aircraft concentrations of the entire war. We're talking about walls of automatic 37mm cannons. But it wasn't just a guy looking down the sights of a gun, right? This was technologically advanced defense.
This was the introduction of radar-predicted anti-aircraft fire. The Germans utilized mobile Wurtzler radar dishes. These radar systems would track an incoming Allied aircraft, feed the speed, altitude, and trajectory data into complex analog mechanical computers, which would then automatically calculate the exact required lead time and elevation for the flat guns.
So it's aiming for where they're going to be.
Exactly. The guns would automatically track the target and fill a specific box of airspace with high explosive shells exactly where the plane was going to be 3 seconds later. At low altitude, against a slow-moving Hurricane flying a predictable straight-line attack run, it was an impenetrable wall of death.
On December 20th, Clostermann is flying top cover in his Spitfire, orbiting above the target area, assigned to protect the attacking Hurricanes from German fighters. But no German fighters show up. Instead, he has a front-row seat to an absolute massacre. He watches the first Hurricane pilot, a man named Roughhead, push his nose down to begin his attack run. He fires his rockets, but before they even impact, Roughhead's plane is bracketed by radar-guided flak. He takes a direct hit. The Hurricane violently pitches vertically straight up into the air, hangs there suspended for a sickening second, stalls, and then spins directly into the ground, exploding. The precision of the German defenses was absolute. Clostermann watches the second pilot, Pierce, follow him in. Pierce is literally mown down. The radar-guided cannons track him perfectly. A stream of 37mm shells cuts the tail section of his Hurricane cleanly off. The plane disintegrates and crashes into the trees. A third pilot dives in and is instantly vaporized into an inchoate mass of flame. Clostermann is watching entire squadrons of his friends being systematically erased in front of his eyes by automated machines.
And then comes the order that defies all logic. The Hurricane attack has failed. The flight leader of Clostermann's Spitfire squadron keys his radio and orders his pilots to dive down and attack the flak site themselves, to use their 20mm cannons against reinforced concrete bunkers protected by radar-guided artillery.
In Spitfires that aren't even equipped with bombs, it is a completely futile gesture born out of sheer frustration and rage. But Clostermann obeys. He rolls his Spitfire onto its back and dives vertically down to 10 feet off the ground. He is flying lower than the treetops. The moment he levels out, the German radar locks onto him. 5 separate flak posts crossfire on his plane simultaneously. The noise inside the cockpit is deafening. He hears the violent metallic cracking of shells exploding all around him. He takes 3 direct hits right through his wings. By some absolute miracle, the high explosive shells pass clean through the thin aluminum without detonating.
He is flying at 340 miles an hour, 10 feet off the ground, violently throwing the stick left and right to dodge poplars, farmhouses, and high-tension electrical wires, trying to break the radar lock.
The physical sensation of terror he describes here is visceral. He says his mouth fills with the bitter taste of gall. He feels his muscles literally liquefying, turning to water, losing all strength. He is gripping the stick in pure panic. He pulls up violently to escape, and he is so low that his right wing literally smashes through the upper branches of a tree, shattering the wood and tearing the metal of his wing leading edge. He manages to limp into the clouds, his plane shredded, his elevator controls barely responding because they are full of bullet holes.
I want to focus on the psychological aftermath of an event like this.
Yes, exactly, because I read this and I just cannot fathom the human mind's ability to cope. At this point in the war, they aren't even fighting other human beings in the sky, matching skill against skill. They are flying blindfolded through a gauntlet of automated motion sensor machine guns. You watch your friends turn into vapor. You get your own plane physically shredded by trees and shrapnel. You taste bile in your mouth. You land. You shake uncontrollably. How do you wake up the next morning, sit in the mess hall, eat your eggs and bacon, and not just flat out refuse to get back in the airplane? How is there not mass mutiny?
It is the ultimate question of military psychology. How does a human endure the unendurable? It is a complex amalgamation of factors. First is the shared trauma, the intense tribal loyalty to the men in your squadron. You know that if you refuse to fly, one of your mates has to take your place and fly into the meat grinder instead. You cannot be the one to let them down.
Right, you'd be abandoning your friends.
Exactly. Second is the sheer unstoppable momentum of military discipline and the bureaucratic machine. But fundamentally, on a deeply personal level, surviving this requires a horrifying psychological adaptation. You have to actively sever the part of your brain that projects a future. A normal person plans for next year, for a career, for a family. These pilots had to stop believing they would survive the war. They had to accept, at a cellular level, that they were already dead men. The man eating eggs and bacon isn't planning for a long life. He considers himself a ghost whose only remaining biological function is to inflict damage on the enemy before the inevitable happens.
It's an absolutely haunting way to live. And to try and pull these men back from the brink of total psychological collapse, High Command finally decides to rotate the squadron out for a period of rest. But in 1944, the military definition of rest is highly subjective. They are sent away from the bloody front line in France all the way up to the Orkney Islands, at the very northern, desolate tip of Scotland.
The environment is incredibly bleak. Freezing winds, snow-covered rocks, gray skies. Their assignment was theoretically defensive to protect the massive British home fleet anchored at Scapa-Flow from high-altitude German reconnaissance planes. It was supposed to be a quiet sector.
And this brings us right back to the very first image of our deep dive, the chess game. Because this quiet sector provided the stage for one of those extreme physical encounters of Clostermann's entire war.
It is February 1944. They are sitting in that freezing readiness hut.
Clostermann is intensely focused on his chess game. He is about to lose his queen, the siren goes off, the board is knocked over, he sprints out into the freezing wind, but he isn't running to a clapped-out, clipped-wing Spitfire VD this time. He is running to a highly specialized, incredibly rare piece of engineering.
He is strapped into the Supermarine Spitfire Mark 7, also known as the Stratospit. This was an aircraft designed for one highly specific, mission-extreme, high-altitude interception. To reach the stratosphere, the engineers gave it drastically lengthened, pointed wings for extra lift in thin air. It had a highly complex, two-stage supercharger on the engine to force dense air into the cylinders at altitudes where oxygen is almost non-existent. And crucially, it featured a pressurized cockpit.
The mechanics of the pressurization are fascinating. A compressor forced air from the engine into the cockpit, trying to maintain a survivable air pressure as the plane climbed. To seal the cabin, the canopy was bolted down, and a rubber tube running around the edge of the glass was inflated with compressed air to seal the gaps. It was rudimentary, claustrophobic, and prone to failure. Clostermann takes off, and the radar controller on the ground begins vectoring him straight up.
The climb is relentless. 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet. He passes 40,000 feet and keeps climbing.
Let's talk about the physics of the environment at 41,000 feet. This isn't just high. This is a hostile, alien environment. The sky isn't blue anymore. It turns a dark, bruised indigo. The air is so thin that without pure oxygen and pressurization, a human being would lose consciousness in seconds, and their blood would essentially begin to boil shortly after. And the temperature is lethal. It is minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit outside the thin metal skin of the plane.
To contextualize that for a modern listener, minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit is the average winter temperature at the South Pole and Antarctica. Modern commercial jets fly at 35,000 feet, and they have massive environmental control systems to keep passengers comfortable. Clostermann is at 41,000 feet in an uninsulated aluminum box, wrapped in layers of thick wool and sheepskin, his breath freezing solid on the inside of his oxygen mask.
Up in this silent frozen void, he finally spots his target. It is a German Messerschmitt 109G, specially modified for high-altitude photo reconnaissance. The German pilot spots Clostermann and his wingman approaching. Knowing he is outnumbered, the German makes a desperate defensive move. He rolls his plane completely over onto its back and pulls the nose straight down into a vertical dive toward the ocean, 8 miles below. Clostermann pushes his stick forward and follows him straight down into the abyss.
And here is where the aerodynamics become violently deadly. In a vertical powered dive from 41,000 feet, the aircraft accelerates at a terrifying rate. The air is so thin that there is very little parasitic drag to slow the plane down. They are quickly approaching the speed of sound. In 1944, nobody fully understood the sound barrier. These planes were not designed with swept wings or aerodynamic profiles meant to fly at transonic speeds.
What actually happens to the plane as it gets close to Mach 1? Clostermann describes the controls completely locking up.
It is a phenomenon called compressibility, or Mach tuck. As the plane approaches the speed of sound, the air molecules literally cannot get out of the way of the wings fast enough. They compress, forming a solid physical shock wave that violently alters the center of aerodynamic pressure. The airflow over the tail surfaces separates into a turbulent wake. When this happens, the control surfaces, the elevators and ailerons, become locked solid. It is as if they are suddenly encased in hardening concrete.
Clostermann's airspeed indicator hits 440 miles per hour, but that is indicated airspeed. In that incredibly thin air, his true speed through the atmosphere is well over 600 miles per hour. The entire airframe begins to scream and violently vibrate as the shockwaves batter the aluminum. He's literally standing on the rudder pedals with all his weight, gripping the control column with both hands, muscles trembling, using every ounce of his physical strength just to keep the plane flying in a straight line. The extreme friction and vibration are literally tearing the camouflage paint off the leading edges of his wings.
The physical stress on the airframe is catastrophic, and the German pilot ahead of them finds the structural limit of his machine first.
Yeah, Clostermann's wingman, diving alongside him, manages to fire a tiny, desperate burst from his cannons. A few shells strike the Messerschmitt. At normal speeds, it would be minor damage. But at 600 miles an hour, surrounded by transonic shockwaves, the slightest structural compromise is fatal. The aerodynamic forces violently rip the Messerschmitt apart. Clostermann watches the German plane literally snap in half like a piece of dry tissue paper. The wings tear off, the fuselage explodes, and it disintegrates into a cloud of aluminum confetti in a fraction of a second. The pilot never even had a chance to realize he was dead.
But the destruction of the enemy immediately becomes Clostermann's own nightmare. He is still in a vertical 600-mile-an-hour dive, plummeting rapidly toward the dense air and the solid surface of the North Sea. He has to pull out. But as we discussed, his main control stick is locked solid by the compressibility shockwave. Pulling back on the stick does absolute nothing.
He is plunging toward his death, yanking on a dead stick. As a desperate, absolute last resort, he remembers the trim tab. We talked about this during his first flight, the little mechanical wheel in the cockpit that adjusts a tiny flap on the tail elevator to balance the plane. Clostermann reaches down and violently spins the elevator trim wheel all the way back, trying to use mechanical leverage to force the tail down and the nose up.
It is an incredibly dangerous, almost suicidal gamble. At low speeds, adjusting the trim gives a gentle aerodynamic nudge. At 600 miles per hour, drastically altering the trim creates a massive, instantaneous wall of aerodynamic pressure that forces the nose of the plane violently upward. The structural G-forces generated by the sudden pitch change are enough to snap the wings right off a Spitfire.
His wings miraculously hold, but his body absorbs the trauma. The plane violently yanks its nose up toward the horizon. Clostermann is subjected to an unimaginable spike of positive G-force. I want to explain what this does to a human body. Positive G-force multiplies your body weight. If you are pulling 8 Gs, a 150-pound man suddenly weighs 1,200 pounds. That force pushes all the blood in your body straight down into your legs. Your heart simply isn't strong enough to pump blood back up into your brain against that pressure.
The first symptom is loss of color vision, then tunnel vision, and finally, total hypoxia, loss of consciousness. But Clostermann is experiencing such a violent, sudden onset of G-forces that physical damage is occurring.
He describes a thick, red veil of blood covering his eyes. He feels his spine twisting under the crushing weight, his internal organs feeling like they are tearing loose. His facial muscles distort, sagging heavily, pulling his eyelids down as if invisible. Heavy fingers are physically trying to rip his eyes out of his skull. The capillaries in his retinas and his nasal passages rupture under the pressure, and then he completely blacks out. He is unconscious in a fighter plane doing over 500 miles an hour.
When he finally regains consciousness, the sheer kinetic energy of the dive has rocketed his plane back up to 13,000 feet. The controls are mushy, but responsive. He is alive.
He sits there, gasping for breath, the engine droning on. He feels a warm, wet sensation on his face. He pulls his oxygen mask aside and realizes there is a steady trickle of blood running from his nose, dripping down onto his white silk flying gloves. The extreme pressure change has completely shattered his eardrums. He is totally deaf, and his radio headset has been physically crushed against his skull by the G-forces. He has to fly the crippled Spitfire back to the Orkney Islands entirely on instinct, reading the geography of the coast in total silence.
It is the absolute razor's edge limit of human biology and mechanical engineering. But astonishingly, this freezing supersonic duel in the stratosphere was merely the prelude to the defining moment of the century. Because while Clostermann was bleeding in the upper atmosphere, the entire Allied world was gearing up for the largest amphibious invasion in human history.
D-Day, Operation Overlords, May 1944. Clostermann, now an incredibly seasoned combat veteran with intimate knowledge of the French coast, is pulled from frontline flying and sent to the underground command bunkers at RAF Uxbridge near London to help plan the fighter cover for the invasion.
The diary entries here provide a brilliant, jarring contrast. He goes from the solitary, freezing terror of the cockpit at 41,000 feet to a claustrophobic, fluorescent-lit concrete bunker buried deep underground. He describes it as a Tower of Babel. It is swarming with hundreds of air marshals, American generals, intelligence officers, and waifs pushing models across massive map tables.
And what are these brilliant military minds doing down in this bunker on the eve of the invasion? They are arguing, bitterly. They are having a massive bureaucratic fight over statistics. This part of the diary blew my mind. There is a massive dispute between the British RAF and the American United States Army Air Forces over a single vital number, exactly how many German fighters have been destroyed and how many are left to oppose the landings.
It is a perfect example of the fog of war generated not by a lack of information, but by an abundance of flawed data. The Americans were claiming staggering, massive numbers of German fighters shot down by their bomber gunners, over 4,000 kills in just a few months. The British High Command, looking at their intelligence networks inside Europe, found these numbers completely absurd. The RAF required strict, synchronized sun camera footage from the wings of their fighters to officially confirm an aerial kill.
Clostermann watches them realize the fatal flaw in the American bomber statistics. When a formation of 500 American B-17s is attacked by a single German Focke-Wulf, 50 different machine gunners and 50 different bombers might shoot at it simultaneously. If the German plane catches fire and goes down, all 50 gunners report back to their base and honestly claim, "I shot down a German fighter." The intelligence officers log 50 kills instead of 1.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that inflates the numbers fast.
The British planners in that bunker literally had to take a red pen and slash the official American kill claims by a massive 2/3, just to generate a realistic working estimate for how many German squadrons would be waiting over the beaches of Normandy. It is a stark reminder of the cold, calculating mathematical bureaucracy of war occurring right alongside the visceral bleeding horror.
And when the math was finally settled and June 6th finally arrived, Clostermann was released from the bunker and sent back to the sky. He was in the air, looking down at the realization of all that planning.
The scale of D-Day from the air is almost incomprehensible. He flies over the English Channel at dawn, and he writes that the water is completely obliterated by ships. You couldn't see the waves or the steel. Thousands upon thousands of vessels, from massive battleships firing broadsides that shook the air down to tiny landing craft. And then there were the Mulberry Harbors. I had to look this up when I read it. These were massive, artificial concrete ports the size of small towns that the Allies had secretly constructed in England and were literally towing across the open ocean with tugboats to drop onto the French beaches to unload tanks. The sheer logistical audacity is staggering.
But even with this massive armada, the air cover was an absolute nightmare of coordination. To protect the fleet from German bombers, the Allied fighters had to maintain an impenetrable umbrella of standing patrols over the beaches 24 hours a day.
Clostermann describes the terror of the night patrols. The weather is poor, the cloud cover is low and thick. There are hundreds of Allied fighters and bombers, completely blacked out, no navigation lights, flying blindly in the pitch-dark clouds. They are desperately trying to hunt down the fast, low-flying German Ju-88 bombers that are trying to slip through and bomb the ships. But while they are hunting the Germans, they are terrified of crashing into each other. You have hundreds of nervous young men flying in circles in the dark, constantly staring into the blackness, terrified that an American Mustang or a British Typhoon is going to materialize out of the cloud and slice their plane in half.
He describes looking down through breaks in the clouds at the Normandy beaches below. It is a nightmare landscape painted in fire. The beaches are lit up by the massive, blooming orange fires of burning landing craft, the constant strobe-like flashes of naval artillery, and the sweeping arcs of anti-aircraft tracers. He is floating above the greatest turning point of the 20th century, isolated in his cockpit, listening to the drone of his Merlin engine.
It's just staggering. When you step back and look at the entire scope of this deep dive, the journey is overwhelming. We started with this young, terrified man, trembling as he recited the BTFC PPUR drill in a pristine Spitfire over the quiet hills of Wales. We felt the devastating psychological blow of Commandant Mouchot vanishing into the static over France. We waded through the freezing mud, the exploding lanterns, and the fatalistic pub brawls of the advanced airfields. We flew that suicidal zero-altitude flak run against the radar-guided guns of the V-1 sites, tasting the bile of pure panic. We went to the very edge of space, 41,000 feet up in the stratosphere, pulling G-forces that physically ruptured blood vessels. And we ended looking down at the monumental, history-altering inferno of D-Day. Yeah, an incredible scope. He survived 420 of these combat sorties. When you break down the mechanics, the physics, and the sheer volume of metal flying through the air, it is hard to even wrap your mind around the statistical impossibility of a human body living through that, let alone retaining the sanity to write a diary about it.
The concept of sanity is exactly where I think we find the deepest lesson here. I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder about Pierre Clostermann and the thousands of men like him. Consider the intense, almost unfathomable psychological compartmentalization required to exist in that reality. Think about the stark, violent duality of his daily life. For hours at a time, he was locked in a frozen, cramped metal box. He was subjected to centrifugal forces that literally tore the capillaries in his face. He actively hunted and incinerated other human beings at point-blank range. He watched his closest friends, men he drank with the night before, disintegrate into vapor and ash right beside him in midair.
Just horrific trauma.
Right. And then a few hours later, he would land. He would wash the oil and blood off his face. He would sit down at a small wooden table in a quiet room, pour a cup of tea, open a cheap Air Ministry notebook, and write profoundly poetic, highly technical, and deeply observant, tender entries to his parents.
Writing those letters, knowing full well that his parents would only ever read those words if a military officer knocked on their door in Africa to tell them their son had been blown to pieces over the English Channel.
Exactly. What happens to a human mind that is forced to constantly, violently oscillate between those two extremes? How do you maintain a stable identity when you are swinging like a pendulum between savage, mechanical survival instincts and tender, reflective humanity? How do you hold the psychological capacity to rip a man's plane in half with high explosive shells at 600 miles per hour in one hand and the pen to write a beautiful, longing love letter to your mother in the other? It is a testament to the terrifying adaptability of the human spirit.
It is a profound, deeply unsettling paradox. And it's one that The Big Show captures better than almost any other book of the era. Thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive. The next time you walk outside, I invite you to take a moment and just look up at the clouds. Look at that vast, quiet blue space and try to visualize the invisible, terrifying, and utterly surreal history that once played out right above our heads. A place where a quiet game of chess could turn into a bleeding supersonic dive in the stratosphere in the blink of an eye. We'll see you on the next deep dive.